digital scholarship at some fundamental level in order to build those relationships, that the digital is the means of building and maintaining those connections in the context of the kinds of work that go on our campuses. So I'm going to give you a bit of background on how I came to this. I come through a slightly idiosyncratic path. I graduated with a PhD in English and fully intended to do normal book writing kinds of work, which I still do some of, obviously. But back in 2002, after I'd been at Pomona for a few years and I had finished the process of doing the revisions of the dissertation into that first book manuscript, I found myself feeling really stifled. Years of work seemed like they were stuck on my hard disk. And there was the very real possibility, it seemed to me, that no one might ever read it. And I, as it turns out, wasn't wrong about that. It took another 4 years from that point for the book to actually see print. So in the meantime, I've got all this work, I've got all these ideas, I've got nobody to share them with. And then I stumbled across the blog of a friend of mine from grad school. And it was funny, and it was erudite, and most importantly for my purposes, it had an audience, which I knew that it had because people left comments on it, responding to him and engaging in different kinds of discussions around the things that he was writing. And I thought, holy moly, this is it, right? Like, this is the way that I need to get material out there to the world. So my blog, this is what it looked like in 2002. Which I started out of the baldest possible desire to get somebody somewhere to read something I wrote. Wound up doing something unexpected for me. It helped me build a community that I have been working with ever since. I found online a number of early academic bloggers who were also, like me, engaged in some ongoing link and comment conversations with other bloggers out there. And those relationships, which really opened up into a growing network of scholars who were attempting to do their work openly online, were really crucial to me as a somewhat isolated assistant professor. I mean, I had found myself really struggling to make the connections that I needed in order to help my writing develop and help it find an audience. And it was the blog that provided the first opportunity that I found. And even more, some of the posts that I published on the blog turned out to be the first pieces of my writing to be cited in more formal professional venues, right? So it took on a reality for me that when I started it, I wasn't expecting at all. So fast forward to the moment in 2009 when I had just finished the draft of what became my second book, Planned Obsolescence. Rather than simply have the manuscript sent out to the 2 to 3 anonymous readers that the press would conventionally have sent it to, I asked them to let me post the draft online for open comment as well. I get asked a lot about that decision. Usually framed in asking me about how I worked up the courage to do something like post my work openly online. And the truth of the matter is that all of the risks of what could have happened just simply didn't figure into my thinking. What I knew was that there were a lot of folks out there in a lot of different fields, in a lot of different places with different kinds of jobs in and outside universities, with whom I'd had really productive, engaging interactions online that contributed to the development of the manuscript as it stood. And I wanted to hear their thoughts about where I had ended up. So I trusted them to help me, and as it turns out they did, absolutely overwhelmingly so. So it is important for me to stop and acknowledge the entire boatload of privilege that this kind of naivete about my ability to just put work online requires, right? I was writing from a sufficiently safe position. At that point, I did have all the tenure I could get. That allowing the flaws in my work to be visible online really didn't pose any threat to me. And it's also not incidental that this was 2009 and not 2019, right? That all of the events of the last few years, from Gamergate through the 2016 election and all of its fallout, have made the risks of opening one's work up online really palpable. But my own personal experiences with the blog, with the book manuscript, and with the other projects that I've opened to public discussions, like I did with Planned Obsolescence, still leave me convinced that there is a community, real or potential, that's interested in the kind of work that I care about, that we care about, and that's willing to engage with and support that work's development. And so perhaps most importantly today, that audience is also willing to work on building and sustaining the connections that make up the community itself. So in 2018, I tested that belief by opening Generous Thinking to a similar kind of process, asking for public comment on the manuscript. And between early February and the end of March of 2018, I staged a process in which I first invited a few readers to spend 2 weeks commenting and reading and commenting, hopefully in that order, on the manuscript. And then after that, opened it to the world so that anyone could come in and respond. And in the end, 30 commenters left a total of 354 comments and prompted 56 responses from me. And that breadth of reading really gave me a rich view of the revision process that lay ahead, where I really needed to focus my attention, where I was missing the mark. Now, I do want to say, that one of the concerns about open peer review processes like this is often that reviewers are going to be too nice, right? That they're going to pull their punches, they're not going to be honest, that they're going to, be delicate. And I want to note that in this review process, everyone was supportive, right? But it wasn't all rainbows and unicorns. There are at least a couple of comments in here that stung when I first read them, but they were key to really the rethinking that I needed to do, right? They were pointing out gaps in my thought that I needed to spend some more time with. And so I am absolutely convinced that the book is much better for having gone through this open process than it would have been otherwise. So what I'm focused on in thinking about working in the open, about the ways that a digital scholarship network like the one that's being built here can enable scholars to build new kinds of communities like the one that I had the opportunity to build through that blog. And these are communities that can develop within our fields, with scholars in other fields, and with folks off campus who care about the same kinds of work that we care about. By finding ways to connect with readers and writers beyond our usual circles of experts in a range of different registers and in ways that allow for meaningful multi-directional exchange, I think that we can create the potential for far more substantial public participation in and engagement with the humanities and with the academy more broadly. We can build programs and networks and platforms that don't just bring the university to the world, but that actually involve the world in the university. Now, there are some real obstacles that have to be faced in any kind of process like this. Some of them reflect changes in contemporary communication platforms. For instance, blogs just simply don't produce the same level of engagement that they used to in the early 2000s. And some of this has to do with their massive proliferation, right? There are so many of them that conversation is spread all over the place. In part, it also has to do with the dispersal of online communities and conversations into spaces like Facebook and Twitter, where they get removed from the original writing and conversations happen in closed networks. This is where the business about flawed sociality starts to come in. But as a result, online communities of readers and writers are far less likely to develop spontaneously than they were at that early moment when blogging was new and exciting. Right? It really requires a determined, deliberate effort to build community around the work, reaching out to potential readers and participants in the work, and finding ways to draw them and to draw ourselves as well back into a kind of sustained conversation. And of course, the nature of internet discourse has changed. in recent years as much as has its location. Trolls are not a new phenomenon by any means. The earliest days of online communication see similar kinds of flame wars and trolling as we now experience. But trolls have certainly multiplied, and the damage that they can inflict has escalated quite severely. So taking one's work public can involve significant risk, especially where that work involves questions of social justice that are under attack by malevolent groups online, and especially for already marginalized and underrepresented members of the academic community who open up engagement with an often hostile world. So I don't want to suggest that I have easy answers to these problems. I don't have a perfect platform to offer, and I don't know how to fix the malignant aspects of human behavior. Countering these kinds of, countering these destructive forces really requires advanced preparation, both individually and institutionally, and focused responses when things go wrong. And ensuring that public discourse about scholarly work remains productive requires a lot of collective labor, not just the labor of the individual scholar, but of the community the scholar is working with, including the careful development and maintenance of trust in order to create inclusive online communities that can be both open to and yet safe in the world. But there are several other challenges beyond these that I also want to explore a little bit today. Some challenges that are about the ways that we as scholars do our work, the ways that we can draw a range of broader publics to that work, and the ways that we can ensure that the work that we do together is supported in an ongoing way. But the first of these challenges that I want to talk about is the need to ensure that the work that we do can be discovered and accessed by any interested reader, and not just by those readers who have ready entry to well-funded research libraries. And it should go without saying that it's impossible for anyone to care about any of the work that we do if they can't see it. Right? And yet, perhaps because we assume that we're mostly writing for one another, the results of our work tend to end up overwhelmingly in places where it can't be found by the public, and even if it is found, where it can't be accessed by them. The second challenge lies in ensuring that the work is accessible in a different sense. I mean, not just allowing readers to get their hands on it, but enabling them to see in it the things that they might care about. We often resent the ways that academic work gets dumbed down in public venues. So it seems important for us to think instead about the ways that we can productively mainstream our arguments, engaging readers where they are, rather than forcing them to come to us in our venues and on our terms. Beyond access and accessibility, however, if we hope to engage the public in our work, we need to ensure that it's open in the broadest possible sense, that it's open to response and to participation, to new kinds of cultural creation by more kinds of public thinkers. We need, in other words, to focus not just on the public's potential consumption of the work that we do within the university, but also about the potential modes of co-production that involve communities in the work of the university. These kinds of collaborations might serve as a style of work that our universities can fruitfully model for the rest of our culture, right? New modes of scholarship done not just for, but with the world. So networks for digital scholarship, like the one that's going to be built in and around this space, have the potential to create the conditions for greater access, greater accessibility, and greater public participation in the work that we all do as scholars. And by encouraging this kind of work, I don't mean to suggest that there's no room for more traditional modes of internal exchange among field-based experts, right? There is, of course, room for that, and there should be. But the 21st century university needs as well to provide the means by which the results of those exchanges can become part of the larger cultural conversations that are taking place around us. So our work here on campus doesn't need to address or engage absolutely everyone all the time. But different aspects of our work might engage with different audiences at different moments. And knowing how to think about those public audiences, indeed, knowing how to think about them not just as audiences, but as potential interlocutors, is a really crucial skill for today's scholars, and a skill that needs to be cultivated and supported. Now, the simplest way of making more scholarly work more available to the public is by making that work available through open access venues. There's a long history to the open access movement, obviously, and I dig into it further in the book, and including the ties between the history of that movement and the ties that the movement created between the more altruistic goals of open access, right? Establishing and supporting a globally equitable mode of distributing knowledge, and then the more pragmatic arguments that the movement made about the impact that public access scholarship might have on the advancement of research. The point of all of that history, however, turns out to be that what's good for scholars is good for the public too, right? So everybody wins in a more open environment. Because if we publish in ways that enable any interested reader to access our work, the work winds up more read, more cited, creating more impact and more visibility for us in our fields. Right? Making our work more openly accessible enables scholars in areas of the world without extensive library budgets, as well as US-based instructors and institutions, instructors and students at undergraduate teaching institutions, for instance, and secondary schools to use this work. So making our work openly available allows it to reach other interested readers across the increasingly broad humanities workforce who may not have access to research libraries. The importance of that particular bit of access became most clear to me when I found out that my granting officer at the NEH did not have access to a lot of the work that was being funded by the agency because he didn't have an institutional appointment with a research library. So something's wrong at that point. All of this expanded access can really produce an expansion in our readership and an expansion in our influence, which would seem to be unmitigatedly a good thing. And yet it's clear that we as scholars often resist opening our work to broader publics. Many of us keep our work restricted to our own discourse communities because of some of the things that I talked about earlier. We fear the consequences of making it available to a broader public, and not without justification. The public does seem often determined to misunderstand us, or at least to interpret what we say with focused hostility or utter dismissiveness. Because the subject matter of much of the humanities and social sciences seems as though it should be accessible, right? It's just our culture, we all live it. Why shouldn't I be able to understand everything that's written about it? Our determination to wrestle with difficult or highly politicized questions and our use of expert methods and vocabularies can feel really threatening to a lot of readers. They fail to understand us. We take their failure to understand as an insult. Sometimes it is, but not always, right? Given this failure to communicate, we end up seeing very little harm in keeping our work closed off from the public. We're only writing for a small group of specialists anyhow, so why would open access matter? Well, it matters because the more we close our work away from the public and the more we turn away from dialogue across the boundaries of the academy, the more we undermine the public's willingness to support our research in our institutions. As numerous public humanities scholars, including Kathleen Woodward, have argued, the major crisis facing the funding of higher education today is an increasingly widespread conviction that education is a private responsibility rather than a public good. And we wind up strengthening that conviction and worsening the crisis when we treat our work as if it were private. Closing our work away from non-scholarly readers might, in the end, protect us from certain kinds of public criticism, but it can't protect us from public apathy, which is a condition that may be far more dangerous in the current economic and political environment. And the risks are real, right? Especially, again, for scholars working in politically engaged fields, but only through dialogue that moves outside our own discourse communities will we really have a chance of convincing the broader public, including our governments, of the importance of what it is we do on campus. And of course, engaging readers in thoughtful discussions about the important issues that we study lies at the core of the academic mission. It's at the heart of our values. We don't create knowledge in order to hoard it, but instead, every day in the classroom, in the lecture hall, in our writing, we embrace an ethic of generosity, of paying forward knowledge that we've received as a gift. We teach as we were taught, right? We publish as we learn from the publication of others. And we can't really pay back those who came before us, but we do give to those who come after. Our participation in the ethical, voluntary, scholarly community is grounded in these obligations that we hold for one another, obligations that derive from the very generosity that we have similarly received. Okay, super idealistic, right? And that kind of idealism is all well and good, but it doesn't adequately account for an academic universe in which we are evaluated based on individual achievement and in which prestige often overrides all other values. So in the book, I do dig into the institutional responsibility for and the effects of that bias toward prestige toward the end of the project. But today, I wanted to think just a little bit about its effects on the individual scholar, as well as that scholar's role in perpetuating the hierarchical status quo in which we work. Surveys of faculty publishing practices indicate that scholars choose to publish in venues that are perceived to have the greatest influence on their peers. And that influence is often understood to increase with exclusivity, right? The more difficult it is to get an article into a particular venue, the higher the perceived value in having done so. But this kind of reasoning too easily shades over into a sense that the more exclusive that publication's audience, right, the more value the publication has. And this is at its most benign a self-defeating attitude. I mean, if we privilege exclusivity above everything else, we end up undermining the potential impact that our work can have. As David Perry has commented, knowledge that is not public is not knowledge, right? It's only in giving it away, in making it publicly available, that we produce the thing that we really think of as knowledge. So as it is, most of the players who are engaged in this whole process of scholarship and scholarly communication have always been engaged in giving it away, right? Authors, reviewers, scholarly editors, and others involved in the process have long offered their work to others without requiring direct compensation. The question is, of course, how we offer it and to whom. In fact, the entire system of scholarly communication runs on an engine of generosity. It's a gift economy, ultimately, one that demonstrates the ways that private enterprise can never adequately provide for the public good. So rather than committing our work to private channels, signing it over to corporate publishers, for instance, that profit at higher education's expense, how might all of the members of the university community, from researchers, instructors, libraries, presses, administrations, all of us instead work together to develop and support systems that are based instead on our highest values? I mean, what if we understood sustainability in scholarly communication not as the ability to generate revenue, but instead as the ability to keep the engine of generosity running? What might that work look like? Now, it's important to distinguish between that call to generosity, that call to the gift economy, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the injunction to work for free that has been produced by the devaluing of so much intellectual and professional labor within the information economy. A mode of forced volunteerism has really spread throughout contemporary culture, compelling college students and recent graduates to take on unpaid internships in order to get a foot in the door, compelling creative professionals to do free work in order to build exposure, and ultimately restricting opportunity to those who can afford to seek it. So we know as well that there are academic equivalents to these situations that I just described: vastly underpaid adjunct instructors, overworked graduate assistants, an ever-growing list of mentoring and other service requirements that fall disproportionately on the shoulders of junior faculty, women faculty, and faculty of color. So again, labor, right, is the primary reason that I'm not simply saying we can do everything for free and make all our work available for free online. While the scholarship itself might be provided without charge, the authors have by and large been paid by their employers or by their granting organizations, and will be compensated with a publication credit, a line on a CV, a positive annual review outcome, and so forth. Reviewers in the scholarly communication environment are rarely paid, almost never by journals, and very, very modestly by book publishers. But they often receive insight into developing work and the ability to shape their fields and support their communities by way of compensation. But there's a vast range of other kinds of labor that's necessary for the production of publications, even when distributed online, that needs to be taken care of. Submissions have to be managed, authors have to be communicated with, there's copy editing, there's proofreading, there's website design and maintenance, and so on. And all of this demands support. We need to understand that labor as professional and ensure that it's compensated accordingly. So again, where I'm asking for generosity is from those who are fully credited and compensated, especially those tenured and tenure-track members of the faculty and other fully employed members of our professions who can and should contribute to the world the products of the work that they've been supported in undertaking. And similarly, generosity is called for from those institutions that can and should underwrite the production of scholarship on behalf of the Academy and the public at large, right? It's our mission and our responsibility to look beyond our walls to the world beyond, to enlarge the gifts that we have received by making them public. But doing so requires that we hold the potential for public engagement with our work among our highest values, that we understand such potential engagement as a public good that we can share in creating. Now, there are steps beyond simply making the work available publicly. Critics of open access often argue that the public couldn't possibly be interested in scholarly work, they can't understand it, and so they don't need access to it. And though I would argue that those critics are wrong in the conclusion, they're at times not wrong in the premise. Our work doesn't always communicate terribly well to general readers. And again, that's fine under the right circumstances. Communication within a discourse community plays a crucial role in that community's development, and there always has to be room for specialized expert-to-expert communication around the work that we do. But that kind of inwardly focused sharing of work has been privileged to our detriment. Scholars are not rewarded and at times can even be actively derided for publishing in popular venues. And because the values instantiated by our reward system have a profound effect on the ways that we train our students, we end up building the wall between the public and scholars higher and higher with every passing cohort. Now, there are a lot of scholars who've been pushing against this. There are lots of public-facing publications like Los Angeles Review of Books and Public Books, both started by academics, but really facing out into the world. And there are a host of other kinds of digital projects that will no doubt grow out of a space like this one, that allow scholars to work in multiple registers and engage with multiple audiences. These venues open scholarly concerns and conversations to a broader readership, and they demonstrate the public value of scholarly approaches to understanding contemporary culture. But if we're going to open these ideas to larger public audiences, we really do need to give some serious thought to the mode and the voice of our writing, right? And think about how we might reach out in ways that are publicly grounded and yet not anti-intellectual. We've been trained to focus on complexity and nuance in our writing, and the result is often argumentation that's more complicated and less straightforward than it might be. And so getting past the kinds of accusations about obscurity and irrelevance that get cast at scholarly work is going to require us to really open up our rhetoric, to demonstrate to a generally educated reader how and why the work that we do matters. And again, not all of the work that we do needs to be publicly accessible or in that public register, but we would benefit from doing more of it that way. I mean, our work in the classroom demonstrates that we are capable of opening up really difficult work for readers who are just coming into work with us at this point. And we can do this in more public ways. But if we're going to do it, we need to be prepared to bridge certain kinds of communication gaps and really hone our ability to alternate speaking. I think I'm getting close to the end here. A key component of this work, of the public intellectual though, is really not just simply addressing an audience that is available out there in the public, but really building that public in the first place. The fragmentation of the public that we've noted over the last years, and particularly in the last couple of years, has caused a lot of us to contribute to the fragmentation, frankly, by retreating into private conversation with one another. And as we've done so, we've withdrawn scholarly perspectives from that public view. We've contributed to the disappearance of a coherent sense of what the public may have been. So if we're going to return to public discourse as scholars, if we're going to connect with and perhaps even be responsible for helping to create and facilitate a range of broader publics, we're going to need to contend with the multiplicity of the publics with which we engage, even as we try to draw them into dialogue with us. And most importantly, I think we need to recognize that the scholars who are doing this kind of public work are doing work that is not just public but also intellectual, right? Our processes of evaluation and assessment too often shove things that don't meet a relatively narrow set of criteria for research into the category of service. And as a result, when scholars make the transition to more public prose, their work often goes underreported back on campus. And writing for the public is often assumed to be less well developed than scholarly writing, when in fact it's often likely to have been far more stringently edited than scholarly work often is. And worse, the academic universe too often assumes that a scholar who writes for a public market must have had to dumb down their ideas in order to do so. So if we're going to make publicly engaged digital scholarship genuinely sustainable, we need to ensure that it's properly respected and properly rewarded on campus, so that the focus can genuinely be placed on engaging with the communities that the work is trying to reach. And this is in some ways the heart of the problem, right? We too often don't know how to reach the publics we would like to be in communication with, because on some level we don't understand them. And as I argue at length in the larger project, this is in no small part because we tend to spend a whole lot more time talking to them about stuff than we do listening to their interests. And we need to make room for the public, not just in our address, but also in the arguments that we're having ourselves and in our prose. We need to understand those arguments in that prose as part of a larger multi-voiced conversation. And that's the key thing, right? Having helped to transform an audience into something like a public, we need to find ways to activate that public so that it can do similar work on its own behalf. And this is where working in public, right? Creating public access, valuing public engagement, becoming public intellectuals begins to transform into the creation of a genuinely public scholarship, right? A scholarship that isn't just performed for the public, but that includes and is in fact given over to the publics with whom we work. In public scholarship, members of our chosen communities enter into our projects not just as readers, but as participants, as stakeholders in those projects. So recent experiments in citizen science provide some potentially interesting examples. Projects like Galaxy Zoo that go beyond crowdsourcing and toward enlisting networked participants, not just in mass repetitive kind of mechanical Turk type tasks, but in the actual process of discovery within the science. But what might the citizen humanities look like? It might, for instance, look like museum exhibits, such as Pacific Worlds at the Oakland Museum of California, which engaged members of local Pacific communities in the planning and development processes for the show. It might look like the September 11th Digital Archive, developed by the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University and the American Social History Project, which presents first-hand accounts of the events of that day, along with photos, emails, and other archival materials from more than 150,000 participants. It might look like the Baltimore Stories Project at UMBC, which used humanities scholarship as a convening force to bring together community organizers, educators, and nonprofit organizations to explore narratives of race in American life. And what all of these projects have in common is that each of them explores a cultural concern of compelling interest to the public that the project engages, precisely because that concern belongs to them, right? This work is theirs not just to learn from, but to shape and define as well. And engaging those publics in working with scholars to interpret, to understand, and to teach their cultures and histories can connect them with the projects of the university in ways that might help cultivate a deeper understanding of and support for what it is the university does and why. By working in these kinds of publicly engaged ways and by bringing these publics into self-reflexive modes of humanities and social science-based critique, we have the potential to create a renewed conception of how intellectual life operates in contemporary culture. But that renewed conception is going to require us to be open to a new understanding of the notion of who our peers are. Open public scholarship might lead us to understand the peer not just as a pre-existing credential, but instead as a status that emerges through participation in the processes of a community of practice. And changing this definition has profound consequences, not just for determining who we address with this label, but also who considers themselves to be part of the community that we are in. Opening the notion of the intellectual peer to a broader range of forms of critical inquiry and active project participation has the potential to reshape relations between town and gown, and to lay the groundwork for more productive conversations across the borders of the campus, and to create an understanding of the extent to which the work of the Academy matters for our culture as a whole. And much of that work begins with projects like this one, the DSSN, which provides not just a place where collaborative public scholarship in new forms can be invented, but the networks through which it can be realized. An institutional structure like the DSSN enables us to ask what might be possible if we were to open up our scholarly practices to real public engagement, to deep interdisciplinarity, and to new modes of working. And how can networks like this one enable public universities like UB to more genuinely focus on the mission of bringing knowledge to the people of the state? How might a network like this draw public support back to the institution by demonstrating the extent to which the work done here is intended for, is in dialogue with, and is in the service of the public? For public institutions to win back public support, they must find ways like this, structurally, strategically, at the heart of not just the mission statement, but the actual mission, to place publicly engaged work at the top of its priorities. And that starts in places like this, where scholars can come together to explore new work in and with the public. Thank you very much.
Responses, questions, rebuttals.
Thank you very much for this talk. It was really wonderful. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the role of libraries in public scholarship, and maybe particularly what you are working with your colleagues at your home institution.
Absolutely. I think libraries are one of several, but really one of the key locuses on campus right now for doing this kind of publicly engaged work. In part because libraries have always been the sort of nexus between the internal campus community and the world beyond, both in terms of collecting the work that is being done in the world for use on campus, but also in terms of opening its doors to the people of the state who can come here and engage with the work that's going on campus. So the library is really crucial. The library is also increasingly becoming the spot where the flows of information on and off campus move in both directions, right? That it's not simply, as we once understood the library, the place where work comes in and is stored, but also the place where work is now done and made available to the world. More and more libraries are becoming increasingly involved in publishing practices and in supporting these kinds of scholarship that are happening and that are going to happen here within the Digital Scholarship Studio and Network. So the library is, I think, a really crucial venue for that work. How to put this? One of the challenges that I have seen at my own institution and that we are now having to work to really get beyond is that there have been in many institutions a sort of inward-facingness in the library focused on its own needs, right? Rather than on the kinds of collaborations with the units that might best make that collective project that we're all engaged in more possible. And this is something that we are actively working on my own particular campus, really thinking about how cross-unit collaborations on campus might make some of the work that we do better. Budgetary structures being what they are, units are often prone to see themselves in competition with one another for resources, and finding ways to get beyond that sense of competition, to really think about what we can do collectively that we can't do alone is going to be a crucial thing. The library is one of the most important places for that work precisely because it belongs to the campus as a whole and not to any one academic unit. So, yay libraries.
I was very interested in the way that you talk about exposure, right? It's this sort of double-edged thing, right? Because we're looking for exposure, but then also no one really likes to be exposed, per se, right?
Right.
And so, it seems to me like part of that's like that personal exposure to being attacked, but the other part is how you become, open to this like algorithmic scraping of everything that you do and every interaction. And then we feel increasingly uncomfortable about how that gets used. So when you're thinking about building these projects, do you see this as like a design challenge? Is this the thing that if you're going to build a network, that there's a design way to confront that? Or?
That is a really interesting question. And I'm not sure. I need to give that some more thought because honestly, I don't know. I think that there are different threats from different kinds of exposure out there, right? And some of them can be prepared for in advance and some of them can't. We do need to take, and I'm seeing increasing discussions around the need for institutions to take data privacy more seriously than it has been taken in the past. Because we are now, as institutions, collecting more and more information about all of us and our every move, swiping in and out of buildings and checking books out through digital systems and looking things up through discovery services and so forth that leave traces everywhere we go. And that information, when it belongs to us and the institution and where we can have some kind of assurance that it's not going to be used for nefarious purposes, that in fact it's not going to be saved, is really crucial. Where we are interacting with corporate systems that are gathering that data as we collect it and that are doing things with it that we might not be aware of, we run into a whole series of risks that we have no means of really preparing ourselves for.
Well, I would actually sort of add on to that and say that part of the problem that we're beginning to have is that so many of the vendors that we use in our academic spaces are requiring you to use corporate accounts to be able to log in or to grant them access to aspects of yourself that the university would never license to allow access to.
Right.
And so you end up, as the researcher, often sharing more of yourself than the campus would share. That in our license agreements, we regularly put information that said we won't share, you won't have access to, but more and more they're just turning on pieces and we don't, if researchers don't tell us that they're asking, we don't know.
Right. So coming back to your question about building digital projects online and how we deal with the potential overexposure of the material that we're using in these projects or that we're contributing to these projects. I mean, it's something that we all need to keep a really serious eye on. And it's one of the reasons why the interdisciplinary collaborations that a space like this one are working toward become all the more crucial. To have people who are well versed in the ways that technology works, but also the ethics of how the information moves, participating together in the development of this work is really key. So I don't have good answers, and I want to think about this some more because it is a form of exposure that I hadn't really considered at the time I was writing this, but it's a key one. Thank you.
I want to go back to your brief remarks about evaluation of scholarship. For two reasons. One is that several associations and universities are now slowly, incompletely developing guidelines for evaluating digital scholarship, especially digital humanities scholarship. And some of that has to do with collaborative work, and some of that simply has to do with work that is never conventionally published.
Right.
But I haven't seen anywhere associations or universities that are developing evaluation guidelines for public. You could say public scholarship, but you could also say public collaborative work. And of course, this is an issue at its most pointed when it comes to kinds of collaboration or outputs that don't have a traditional product form.
Right. There are a few models that I would suggest looking toward. I'm now going to say an acronym and I can't remember what it stands for. NCPH, National something for Public History. NCPH. Coalition, Council, Commission, something. They are a scholarly organization of public historians. And they have been, because they're working in and with the public, do have some guidelines that are highly well respected and also have a very long history of struggle to get the work that they're doing treated seriously as scholarship back on campus. So looking at some of their work, I think would be one good place to start. There are also some guidelines that have been developed specifically for digital projects, but that I think are extensible into other kinds of public scholarship, like the Collaborators' Bill of Rights, which attempts to think through issues of fair labor practices, particularly where volunteers are involved in projects and where students are involved in projects, and are also thinking about fair processes for community engagement. So there's some stuff around that, but I do think that it would be really useful for some of these pieces to be brought together, to think about what the future of scholarship that is public and digital and collaborative all at once has as a set of best practices and then as a set of evaluation practices for that work. Because increasing amounts of work on campus are being done in these ways, and we want to support and evaluate and reward that work on its own terms and in the best possible, most ethical ways. I feel like there are other things. I will let you know if they come to mind.
You know, it's just that these seem in some ways like such disparate ways of working, but you're right that there are potentials for them to be closely related or even,
Absolutely.
Such a somewhat of a related question. I wonder if from your work with MediaCommons, have you noticed any changes over time in how people pushing through in media base and those kinds of sources are having their research evaluated?
That is a really interesting question. I don't know, and I want to know. And this is something that while I was at the MLA, I kept pressing for and wasn't ever able to get any traction with. But I'm going to keep arguing that we need to do this work. So the MLA has its guidelines for the evaluation of digital scholarship for tenure and promotion. And one of the things that I really wanted the organization to do was to do a study of what impact they had out there, to put out a call for narratives from folks who had passed the guidelines on to their chair, who took them to the dean, who then went up for tenure using those guidelines. Like, we don't know. I have a couple of anecdotes, but I don't have any systematic information about how those guidelines change the landscape for tenure and promotion in the field. I would like to know that. I would like to know how folks publishing in MediaRace and other parts of MediaCommons have used that work and how they represent it on their CVs and how it's been taken by the field. I wish I knew. The one bit of evidence that I have for the increasing support of that kind of work is that our MediaCommons' most recent project, which is in transition, the Journal of Videographic Criticism, so video-based critique of film and video. That journal won one of the biggest Society for Cinema and Media Studies awards a couple of years ago, and so is officially recognized as being a journal and B, one that is making real innovation in the field. So I am hopeful that that there is movement happening. I just don't have evidence. Again, I didn't know.